Welcome to tonight's Active Travel Cafe, and we're going to start this evening with our usual crowdsourced news update. If anyone has got anything to share, we always love to hear from around the country, and we'll aim to finish that by 5:15, and then we've got two speakers tonight. We've got Ben Coleman from Phil Jones Associates, and Ben is going to talk about how to create a strategic active travel network, in this case in Oxfordshire. And then we've got Oliver Lord from Clean Cities, who's going to talk about their campaign around car spreading, I assume preventing the said car spreading. So a reminder, if you would like to put any questions for the speakers when we get to that in the Q&A, that would be great. So without further ado, let's start with inviting anyone who's got any news to share from around the UK to offer that up to the group now. Or any questions, you can pose a kind of challenge that you're working on as well. It doesn't have to be news. Adam.
Yeah, Bath and North East Somerset, the latest LTN was called in, and the actual LTN call-in failed, which was prevented. So that's very good. So the other thing about this, which I think is quite important, is I think on the 12th of February, Active Travel England published some new sort of community engagement for transport. And that is a really highly valuable document to put in front of councillors. I would strongly recommend if you can get that, because you get a lot of the opposition was based on a headline figures of online consultations, 73% against versus didn't want it. But and it basically highlights the significant problem with these sort of online consultations and the biases that can create. So yeah, I do think that document, that it's about 19 pages long. It's really good reading. It's definitely something worth getting in front of your councillors if you can, and your officers, because I do think it is extremely good guidance to basically allow transport schemes to basically make sound decisions. That's about it.
That's another thing you can share. Yeah, it doesn't have to be news, could be useful things you've come across. And Adam, if you can find that, I was just looking for it, but I couldn't find it. So if you can post a link to that in the chat, that would be great. Ruth.
Hi, everybody. Again, this isn't news. This is, some of you may or may not have seen this week from Road CC that a young man just over 18 who caused lifelong damage to a man of 69 cycling and changed his life, driving on the wrong side of the road very, very fast round a blind bend. And the judge said this should be punishable by prison, but I'm not going to. So he's got a 1-year suspended sentence and a minimal ban. What I would like is for everybody to write to their MPs, please, to quote this story and to say, we've been waiting for justice since 2014. I wrote to Ruth Cadbury about it, got a letter back saying it would happen. 11 years later, we still don't have proper justice. It's the most shocking incident. Yes, they weren't killed, but, lifelong damage. And again, it's this gung-ho attitude that a driver of 18 is allowed to take off on a car. He'd only just passed his test, and yet government rejected the graduated driving scheme that was put forward lately. So if everyone, I don't know how to find that story, I'm not very good at doing links, but I'm sure someone can. It was on Road CC, and please all write to your MP pointing out this is simply terrifying and it doesn't encourage people to get on bikes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, I'm sure somebody could find that link to that and put it in the chat. Ben.
Hi, everyone. First time calling in live, long time viewer. Yeah, in Watford, we've got a local cycle forum happening on Thursday, which has been going for a few years now, hosted by the Borough Council, where we also have Hertfordshire, the Highways Authority, who attend. Usually we get updates on the LCWIP, lots of plans on paper, but nothing's really happened on the ground yet. But Watford Council did present at Active Travel Cafe a couple of weeks ago about a new route, which is actually all old cycle routes that we already have, but they've added extra signage, which I find quite frustrating. I'll put a link to a video I've done about it, but we need more than just extra signage on old routes. But yeah, hopefully I'll have a better update next week if there's any more movement on the LCWIP. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Tim in Leicester.
Hi everyone, I've just put this in the chat, but Professor Ian Walker, who coined motor normativity, is doing a 1 hour Zoom at 7 o'clock tonight, for those of you who've got time to eat between 6 and 7, on motor normativity for Streets for All. And I think it's mainly aimed at people in Los Angeles, so you can make some new friends while you're on the call. The links are in the chat, but they're all on Blue Sky.
Thanks, Tim. John.
Hi, good evening all. Yeah, we've had quite a lot of good, well, sort of good publicity lately regarding, you may know we have a world famous guided busway from St Ives to Cambridge. It's about 20 kilometres in length, but adjacent to it is a bridleway path, which floods for up to 6 months of the year. So we're trying to apply pressure to the powers that be to actually design a solution and fund a solution to overcome the flooding. And it's gathered quite a lot of public attention. So I'll put a link on it in the chat should anyone be interested to know more.
Thanks, John. Be good to, we've got time to hear from a couple more people. If you can think of any news or questions or useful links, please do share them. In the meantime, I've just got a couple I thought I would mention. One is, so I'm based in Manchester, and in Greater Manchester this week, we, it's not specifically active travel, but what we're on within Greater Manchester is the B network and the kind of building an integrated transport system within which walking and cycling is embedded. And this week we had the launch of Tap and Go, so the kind of connected fare ticketing structure, which means you can now tap in on a bus and a tram, which we've not had. I think if you live in London, you sort of take those sorts of things for granted, but outside of London, they don't exist. But yeah, we've just done that this week in Manchester, so that was quite exciting. And as part of that, if you're familiar with Manchester, you might have seen our e-bikes, our cycle hire schemes, which is sponsored by Starling Bank Bike. So it's Starling Bank Bikes, and we announced we're getting 300 new electric bikes. They're not going to be here till May, so you can't use them yet. But those bikes will be a lot lighter than the current electric bikes, and also they're just a bit nicer and easier to ride and a bit more secure. So that was quite exciting up in Manchester this week. And this isn't anything I know anything particularly about, but I'm just going to post it in the chat now, which is I'm always looking out for kind of interesting schemes that happen up and down the country. And there's consultation that's happening in Glasgow at the moment for, if you know Glasgow, sort of area around Kelvin Grove, I think it's called. And it looks like quite a lot of interesting plans. Glasgow's not as far ahead as sort of where Edinburgh is at, but they've got really big plans, and we have heard from Glasgow before. I really like, if you scroll halfway down that page I've just put in there, how they're using imagery to promote what they're going to be doing. I don't know about you, but I find it, consultations that put out transport planners images, those highways designs, it's really difficult to understand what's going to change, but I think they've got a really nice format in that page, so have a look at that. John, back to you, or is that an old hand?
Legacy hand, sorry.
Legacy hand, cool. Right, so yeah, and sorry to clarify if I gave the wrong impression, not all of our hire bikes are e-bikes. There are 50% of the hire bikes will be e-bikes from May when the new ones arrive. Right, okay, so I think, Ben, we're going to come to you now if you're ready to go. There you are in your booth in your office in London. So yeah, welcome, Ben, from Phil Jones Associates. We've had Phil Jones from Phil Jones Associates, but now we've got Ben Coleman from Phil Jones Associates. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Hopefully, can you see that screen? Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Ben from PJ. I'm here to talk about, well, I was here to talk about one project, but I'm cheekily adding in another one as well, because it's kind of, this project has naturally followed on to a second one. And I think just at the outset, just to kind of like position the project, we've been working with Oxfordshire County Council now for the best part of 3 years on these two projects. On the second project, Oxford Greenways, that's been a collaboration with the County Council, Oxford City Council, and the University of Oxford, who co-funded that second project. That's still live, and public consultations has finished on that. But I thought it made sense to talk about the two, because Oxford Greenways is the natural kind of successor of the SATN project, so they follow quite nicely. Well, this is just repeating myself. This is what I just said. But yeah, so SATN was kind of like just under 2 years in development. So it started in 2022, ended towards the end of 2023, and then Oxfordshire were very succinct in kind of how they've choreographed their projects. And so Oxford Greenways was then funding the source and was commissioned the following year. So this slide is intended just to convey the key differences between the two projects. SATN was predominantly a desktop exercise. Similarities with the LCWIP methodology, but we modified it to be at the scale. Well, it's more we cherry-picked elements of it and then extrapolated that to a county scale. But SATN, so the Strategic Active Travel Network, was intended to be a county-wide project. It also then lent into neighbouring counties as well to make sure there's kind of cross-county contingency, whilst Oxford Greenways has taken a much smaller kind of study area, and the figures at the bottom of these two boxes is giving an indication of kind of the areas we were talking about. So you can kind of see that SATN was about 5 times the size of the Oxford Greenways study area, and also kind of giving an indication of the size of networks that we prioritised and then identified alignments for. The crucial difference with Oxford Greenways is that it is kind of taken on more of a feasibility and a design development role, while SATN was very much a long list of routes across the county, which we kind of did virtual visits of, but there wasn't much more interrogation of the alignments beyond those. I think it's also worth noting that SATN was something that Robin Tucker isn't here, but Robin Tucker and kind of other colleagues of his in Oxfordshire had an initial kind of creation of a county rural a method for developing a network, and so SATN was, I think, and Oxfordshire would admit this himself, was largely inspired and kind of helped by Robin's work. It was very much focused. SATN was very much intended to be focused on the areas between where otherwise the larger settlements would be the subject of an LCWIP or its own kind of movement strategy. So particularly interurban areas. But that said, a key kind of component of the project was actually how did that all tie together, like making sure that SATN was completely succinct and spoke with whatever else was being proposed in the county. I think the interesting thing, which we'll kind of get onto with Oxfordshire, was this methodology for us was, like I said, there were elements of the LCWIP there, but quite a lot of elements were new, and it was actually really like an enjoyable experience with Oxfordshire because we were tailoring new approaches and testing actually did they make sense. There was a large working group as well, which to be honest I found quite daunting. There's upwards of like 40, 50 very clever people scrutinizing our work, but it gave it extra rigor. The nice thing working in Oxfordshire as well, and actually this picture here is on a small settlement, well, a collection of settlements known as the Baldens in South Oxfordshire. But what's quite a nice thing about working in Oxfordshire is that they're progressive, and I think this is something that was mentioned on the call quite recently, that they've even taken on, like, actually enforcing that measure I just showed on the previous slide is being camera enforced. So it's effectively a rural modal filter. They're going to use a timed method to check which traffic there is genuinely like local or destined, going to the villages, and what of that is through traffic. So the fact that in the background Oxfordshire are kind of trying to facilitate and create these mechanisms to support the rural framework and projects like SATN is really helping our case. It's a very simplistic kind of overview of the key differences and, like, I guess, between the two projects. Like I said, SATN was very much network development, so lots of GIS mapping, lots of engagement, prioritization, but the output of it was a very long list of on-the-ground alignments. So we had hundreds of kilometers of identified potential alignments, none of which were kind of really interrogated beyond what we'd identified as being options. Oxford Greenways is then taking that on that project. We're partnered with Sustrans and Maynard. That is actually going out on the ground and doing more rigid feasibility testing of each of those alignments. I've got a few maps just to kind of show, I guess, because I think the thing that's interesting for us is obviously we're talking about a whole county, and there was this is a growing area of work, I'd say, in the country. I know that there are other counties, including Kent and Bucks, that have developed their own means of kind of county-wide prioritisation methods. Each have their own pros and cons. I would say the Oxfordshire approach is very much objective. SATN was very much trying to justify demand and identify demand, but at the same time using public consultation to kind of to check and validate what we were finding. The thing that was interesting for us, I guess, is actually what these next few slides are even just setting the scene of what kind of network are we talking about. You can kind of see here that in terms of the density of the county, there are large parts where there's very low density, like very small settlements. You've kind of got the equivalent of the Randstad in kind of the south and the central of the county, where you've got Oxford, Abingdon, Wallingford, Didcot, and Kidlington, and you kind of got a critical mass of settlements there. But beyond that, they are kind of much more dispersed around the county. Another key consideration was kind of like future proofing of the network. Actually, what are we developing for currently, but also where might people be working and living in the future? Also considering the role of public transport as well. And I think that was a key kind of evolving theme, was actually, well, who is the network for? We kind of did our best to resist the nuance of, you know, drawing cyclists into different types, like commuter, leisure, recreation and whatnot. We felt that we were just trying to make it about access and actually improving access, because also recognizing that these routes aren't necessarily, it's the strategic active travel network. So it is about walked, wheeled, cycled, equestrian trips, not purely about different types of cycling trips. There's also obviously the physicality of the county, and the fact that, you know, you've got this central band of effectively the Thames Valley through the large part of the centre of the county that's quite flat. You've then got the North Downs to the south, and then you've got the Chilterns to the north, which obviously significantly impact the location of settlements, actually what routes are even kind of considered accessible. And so that was obviously that is almost like a fact of what we were working with. So the thing we tried to develop, and this is something we tried to adapt for the county at this scale, was, I say all that about not being too nuanced in the type of cyclists or type of trips we were talking about, but at some point we did have to try and understand where that demand might be. So what we did was kind of combine several data sets just to give us an indication of where we think demand would be for future existing and future trips. So we looked at propensity to cycle tool, acknowledging that that's obviously kind of out of date and commuting focused. We used Strava data, and we also used our own a tool that we call the everyday trips, which is kind of intended to capture what's in the name of like everyday trips, or maybe just going to the library, the GPs, small local trips that sometimes can otherwise slip through the net. And the intention of this, the plan was effectively like a heat map of demand, of us trying to get an indication of where have we got the critical mass of the most demand. So all of those hexes, which I can't actually even make out actually the shape of these, but these are hexagons. Those that got a black outline is effectively where you've got more than one overlap of more than one type of demand. And then actually those particularly around Oxford is where you've kind of got all three. So it suggests there's demand for everyday trips, commuting trips, as well as Strava trips. But we weren't necessarily held to this. This was, again, more just to use an indication of where we thought demand might be. We distilled that down into, so this straight line network effectively was an initial desire line network. The red lines are kind of what we'd indicated from the previous plans, where we thought these are kind of the crude origin destination pairs. We consulted on this online. All the dashed blue lines with extensions that were added. And I think kind of a real crucial thing, a really handy thing that jumped out of this was, you can see like there's a lot of kind of desire lines going over into the neighbouring counties who we engaged with. And actually that's been a really nice, you know, for me, a big win of the project is that actually there's now conversations with neighbouring counties, particularly Bucks, who have some public transport amenities in areas where Oxfordshire doesn't, but there are train stations, for example, in Bucks that are very close and so play a very important role. We effectively absorbed the recommended blue dashed lines into what became the long list of routes. So effectively, this is still kind of like an abstract. These are the desire lines, these black lines. Every little white dot is a settlement. And that's all settlements, so ranging from a hamlet up to cities or the city of Oxford. We've then also plotted onto this existing and future key employment sites, public transport, population centroids. And then what you can see, those yellow areas are our intention to try and capture demand, or try and understand actually what population might these routes serve is we created a 2 kilometre offset for each of those black straight lines. We went 2 kilometres in each direction, and then within that recorded how many settlements was within the catchment of each alignment. In the background, we created an index, a scoring index for every settlement in the county. So we effectively generated a score for each settlement based on a wide range of kind of factors, including access to public transport, population, employment sites, future employment sites, whether they had an LCWIP or not. And so in effect, each settlement had a score. We then used, if I go to the next slide, this was, well, something I tried to put together to try and, it was a bit muddled at one point, so I was trying to simplify the process. I don't know if this helps, but this is trying to, I guess, convey how we kind of, so you look at stage 3 here, we kind of created this, like, identified the settlements that fell within the 2 kilometre buffer. We then had a score for each settlement. We then generated a total score for that offset, i.e. what is the total combined score of all the settlements that fall within the catchment area. Crucially, because every route was different in length, we normalized that to a per kilometre percentage score, so we could compare each section irrelevant of its length. And then in stages 6 and 7, a thing that we did to try and capture potential both top down and bottom up was that we looked at the scores of individual settlements. So stage 6 is looking at this, very short segments between every settlement, whilst 7 was looking at a whole route from beginning to end and considering it as a combined score. The reason we did that was because the risk of looking purely at the long distance route might be that it's slightly skewing the results, and actually it might be a bit arbitrary because we're not necessarily expecting someone to cycle the width of the county for every trip, but it's important to understand their strategic value, whilst stage 6 kind of was making sure that the highest scoring shorter sections were also considered, because it might well be that there's some low hanging fruit where you've got shorter sections that have a really high scoring potential. So we did both simultaneously. The outcome, so effectively the conclusion of SATN was that we got to this long list of route alignments. It's slightly hard to see, but effectively everything in purple and yellow is what SATN identified. So we took the straight desire line network. So this one, the black lines from this were effectively translated on the ground, and myself and Joachim from Oxfordshire, who's not here now, but has been he has been the momentum for both these projects and the key person behind them all. He really, should be presenting with me, but Joachim and I virtually visited all of these alignments to kind of as a sense check of whether we thought there was something viable there or not. So in some instances, the straight desire lines had multiple on the ground alignments. We gave kind of a crude division of the purple alignments are probably like top priority, or those that we consider to be like, they're the ones that had the best strategic value, the higher scores. But crucially, we also had those in yellow, which is effectively like a secondary network. So those that maybe didn't have the strategic case, but something that we wanted to include. I think this plan caused a lot of discussion at the time, because I think for a lot of people living in the county, it was potentially seen as a bit of a death knell that if you hadn't had if a route or you weren't recognised on this plan, did that then mean that you weren't going to get a route in the future? Were you effectively out of the SATN scope? And actually kind of this on the ground is very comprehensive. The idea being that at least we've covered all bases, and as of the project developing, who knows which might get taken forward, and we're not necessarily going to be held to only following the purple routes first and then the yellow. There's flexibility there. So very briefly, and this is still a live project, but Oxfordshire, on the back of the completion of SATN, divided the county effectively into 7 smaller regions. Oxford Greenways was the first of those, and the intention being that SATN would be, each of those 7 areas would then take on the onus of developing their relative part of SATN. The Oxford Greenways created the study area was a 10-kilometre offset from the city's ring road. We extended that, which I can kind of explain why in a moment. The key output of the project was that it would identify and will develop feasibility kind of outline designs for up to 50 kilometers of network within that area. So there's quite a lot more detail on these plans, but I'm kind of conscious of time, so I'll kind of try and be quick. But in essence, for the Oxford Greenways project, we reran the SATN approach. We wanted to have that consistency. We wanted the methodology to follow through. So we kind of used the SATN approach, but we were rerunning it because the scale obviously was much smaller. And so it was important to see, doing it at the smaller scale, did it change any of the results, or did any other alignments come out that we maybe hadn't considered? You can see here that so we slightly extended the study area by about 5 kilometers. This was so that we made sure that all route alignments had kind of intuitive bookends, so that it actually brought in settlements that otherwise it meant some of the routes might have just ended at slightly odd locations. Working at this scale and intensity, that there was obviously a lot of networks. This is like the most densely populated part of the county. So what we found at this stage is that we reran the SATN methodology, but we still had a lot of alignment. So what we ended up doing is crudely grouping these into a series of 9 corridors. So you can kind of see these black outlines is where we picked up the highest scoring SATN scores that were recurring in certain areas. And there was actually quite a lot of commonality of which areas kept generating the highest scores. The key difference at this point, and then moving on to so from here, and then what Greenways did is working with Sustrans in particular was a lot more of an eye on the feasibility actually from a design perspective, and actually the deliverability of these routes. So Sustrans provided a lot of really good mapping and advice on effectively the same methodology they would use in developing NCN alignments. So considering say flooding, ecology, key infrastructure like road and rail infrastructure, and much more of an eye on and landowners, and actually much more of a view on what are the challenges to delivery going to be that we hadn't necessarily in SATN we had considered, but we hadn't scored. So all of these route alignments were given a score against various measures, including things like land ownership, ecology, and the relative complexity of each. That was whittled down to a preferred network that has been consulted on up until last week. So kind of the client are kind of currently combining the results and seeing what that collective feedback means for the project. This was what we went to consultation on in terms of, for now, this is the preferred network of what Sustrans have done their initial desktop review of. So the thick green lines of what they've reviewed, but in the background, you can kind of see in the yellow and the dash green, there's also quite a lot of other routes that, and this is something that's still in development, is actually what even is in and out of the Greenways network, and where do we draw the line of what we consider to be, what is the Greenways network. The consultation was largely around Sustrans route delivery plans. This is a tool that both us and Sustrans use quite regularly, effectively where it's the first impressions and design recommendations for all of the routes. So this involved quite extensive site visits, further ecology kind of testing and looking at actually what the complications might be for delivery, and design recommendations for each route. So I've just got a couple of screenshots here.
Ben, I'm gonna I'll sort of suggest you come to a close in the next couple of minutes.
That would be me. Yeah, don't worry. Lastly, one thing that supplemented it, so as well as what Sustrans did, is we work closely with Maynard, who are kind of like wayfinding and interpretation specialists. They provided quite a lot of recommendations actually in terms of how we wayfind the network, and in the future they've kind of developed a toolkit of what that might look like, what type of infrastructure we use. There's a kind of a bespoke color palette, fonts, actually just making sure that it makes sense on the ground. Very briefly, we can maybe come back to these, but I summarized quite a few points or key things, I guess, discussion points, but maybe if I end there, Sally, we can kind of come back. But these are just the things for us, I guess, designing that rural context. Defining active travel and capturing the demand for that was a key challenge. The third point about design qualities and what is acceptable, there was really varying views across the county of some people that really wanted big infrastructure, like coloured surface tracks, lighting, other parts of the county that didn't want anything to infringe on what they kind of considered to be rural, even points like street lighting, accessing inclusivity, remembering that kind of like, actually who is active travel for, like who is it that's going to be using this infrastructure. And then the last 2 points, I think, and which is something that Oxfordshire have been really good about, is I think they've kept a constant dialogue going through the project. There's been several opportunities for engagement. There's been a working group through both projects. And they've also considered, like wider packages, like points like the wayfinding, and actually how do you embed this in the future of the county's network. There you go.
I think you've impressed a lot of people, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice picture.
Oh, and that's Joachim. Sorry, so actually that's Justin Joachim. So Justin's no longer with PGA, but Justin Joachim, that was the three of us right at the beginning of the project. So I had to say thank you to them.
Nice credit. Right, we've got a few points, quite a few bit of chat going on, and also a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll kick us off with one, and I think there are people from Oxford and Oxfordshire here as well, so anyone else can come in on this. But there's a question about, I guess, buy-in. So I'm assuming this was a commission from Oxfordshire County Council, but Oxfordshire County Council includes 5 local authorities.
Yeah.
Is Oxfordshire County Council the Highways Authority
Yeah.
for the small? So effectively, you were commissioned by the Highways Authority.
Yeah.
Was there any consideration about sort of buy-in and mandate, or because this was a direct commission, the County Council Highways Authority, as the Highways Authority, you know, you felt this is something that they are committed to, obviously subject to funding?
They were there throughout. So in that working group, there was representation of the districts. Again, like I say, like Oxfordshire, very good on that. I think the one thing also that they were quite frank about is, you know, the elephant in the room, I guess, is these routes need to be funded. Like they need to find mechanisms for funding. There isn't funding for these as it stands. There is for some routes, but so incorporating the districts and actually understanding the potential for 106 funding or what there might be available meant that bringing the districts early on was essential, because they had kind of them, I think, much closer to that kind of view. So yeah, they were there throughout.
And while you clearly took a sort of data-led systemic approach, was there any sort of slight back and forth there where districts went, well, you know, we've got this new housing estate here, so could you ever think about that? Or was it quite a kind of generic piece of work?
No, there was. I think it varied. I'd say, I guess, because of for the most part, I'd say a lot of the routes didn't interface with development. Where they did, that was probably in areas where it was piggybacking onto an LCWIP or a settlement somewhere like Didcot or somewhere like Abingdon that already has an LCWIP. So in those kind of situations, we were just making sure that the projects were speaking to each other. But I'd actually say there was less of an onus in that. I think the thing it did identify, and I don't know if this is a quirk unique to Oxfordshire, is that there are a few key development housing sites in the county that are, you know, the location of those is maybe more challenging in terms of public transport and accessibility. And actually in those instances, that's where SATN was really crucial. In those kind of settings is where actually could you supplement those developments with the SATN network.
Thank you. So I'll ask Tim's question first, which is sort of about, joining up. So what happened kind of what happens when you reach the boundaries? You know, did you just then sort of go, you know, there be dragons, not our problem? Or did you have any considerations about how it linked to routes outside the boundary? I think I've summarised your question, Tim.
Yeah, so we had, so the right, so in SATN we went, it wasn't like a hard line, but we went to about 10 kilometers beyond the county border. So in all directions we went beyond, and actually there are plans which I didn't show, but there is demand going beyond the county. So we did we reined it in for the purposes of the initial consultation to be Oxfordshire only routes, only because we didn't necessarily want to speak on the neighbouring counties' behalf. But then almost instantly the feedback was, particularly say from, like I said, Bucks is a good example where there's public transport in Bucks that is used a lot by Oxfordshire residents. So in places like Tame, for example, they're quite often cycling over to get the train. So that was a key point about it, and Oxfordshire did offer to meet with the neighbouring counties to kind of discuss those commonalities.
Thank you. Now, got a question from Ruth in the Q&A, which is many people who may wish to cycle but daunted by lack of joined up routes. So how do you estimate propensity to cycle take up?
So we use in the PCT example, we use as we do on all LCWIPs as well, I guess we use the Go Dutch e-bike scenarios, like the maximum, the most optimistic scenario on PCT. We did also, where possible, we can factor in the future developments as well. But I think like with any project of ours, and it is, I guess, the future of the PCT tool, given 2021's census, is going to be a bit of a challenge. And I think that's why we did use those other data sets, is we didn't want to lean too heavily, and we don't anyway, I guess don't want to lean too heavily on the PCT tool because it is only looking at commuting trips. And I think that is something that, particularly in this setting, wasn't actually, it was obviously influential, but alongside, I'd say, lots of other factors, it wasn't necessarily as important maybe as an urban area.
Okay, I'll ask one more from the Q&A. Or Ruth, did you want to come in on that point? If you want a new point, I'll come back to you.
No, sorry. On that point, I mean, for example, in Chiswick, Kew, Richmond, they built Kew Road cycle route. And because it ends somewhere really, really dangerous, as in crossing Kew Bridge, very few people use it. So the antis classically will say, well, look, they build a cycle lane and hardly anyone uses it. So the problem we have is without connectivity, you can't truly estimate how much people will use it. We know that Blackfriars Bridge, for example, is very, very heavily used because it's nicely joined up to lots of other places. So it is a worry for me that often these schemes don't get built because people will say, well, look, no one uses it, but no one uses it because it's dangerous at one end or the other.
I agree. I think that what we tried to, that's the thing we tried to articulate was, and not necessarily all of this could be articulated by data, but say, for example, that's where public transport was such a key consideration, and also getting it be access to public transport, like rural bus infrastructure. Oxfordshire, there are local train links as well. We did try to get beyond those and articulate that point that it's not just about, again, this is just an inherent challenge of the coining it active travel, is that automatically some people expected us to turn up to meetings in Lycra head to toe. Like we had to broaden like how we were describing the term. I think one thing actually that Danny Yee was on the call, who kind of like from Oxfordshire, and I think like a really interesting thing this about Oxfordshire have been great and very responsive is, so one of the first key bits of feedback that came out of the Oxford Greenways project was, well, you've got the ring road all around the border of the city, so it's all very well having all these routes leading into Oxford, and then what? So we kind of arranged a separate workshop with Danny and Robin Tucker at the county's offices and did a whole workshop purely on, I can't remember how long it is, Danny. Is it like 70 kilometers? I can't remember what you calculated the length. Oh, you're on mute, Danny.
The ring road is 25.5 kilometers around, I think.
25.5. Okay, I was miles off. All right, 25.5. But the point being, so we went. Oh, sorry, Danny. we went then through each intersect effectively of the Greenways route. Well, not just the Greenways routes. We went through each intersect of routes, canals, roads, bridges of the ring road, and effectively scored those and looked at, irrelevant of the Greenways project, what needs to be done in future to get over that. Because exactly like you said, Ruth, otherwise we could have these nice routes to the ring road and then you're dumped.
On that topic, can I just ask Beth's question, which is sort of related, which is in terms of unlocking future development, did you look at future development as well as sort of present demand?
Yeah, so we looked at, that was the key generation of the demand views that we had. So like I said, we effectively generated a score for every settlement in the county. Within that, we had existing population, anticipated future population if the local plans went forward, and also the same with employment as well. So existing employment sites and, in theory, future employment sites. Again, this is all, that was at that time of doing it. I think that's the thing, like, when we do LCWIPs as well, to a point that, you're kind of working with the best data you've got at the time, recognizing that they're live documents.
Yeah. Adam, do you want to come in? And then I'm going to ask one more from the Q&A, and then we'll probably bring it to a close. If you've got any last questions, get them in. Adam.
So at the beginning you said that you had like 40 intelligent people critiquing this space. So was that like external and internal stakeholders? Was it like a mixture of councillors, officers, as well as community groups?
Yeah.
And was there a clarity in terms of, this was supporting LCWIPs rather and basically creating those connections between LCWIPs? I'm guessing that's what the SATN actually did. So sorry, I know it was a two-parter, but does that make sense?
There was, so I guess the group was elected members, officers, key stakeholders as well. So it's quite wide-ranging.
By key stakeholders, you mean people within the council, or
no, external as well.
Okay.
And then it varied in numbers, but it was always very well attended. I think the remit of those, in particular, was the local knowledge point. I imagine, lots of places we work where co-design or development is a key element. There was lots of people that knew the areas better than anyone, local residents and groups that had really strong views. And actually, I do think that was the thing. The diplomacy of this project, that was a challenge in that sense. I do have to say that, the views of active travel range considerably in terms of what was acceptable from a design perspective, but then also this final SATN plan really was felt, I think, by some to be the death knell, that if you didn't have an alignment on there, then you're never going to get a route. So we had to work very close. That's where the local groups really supported us. I think without that, otherwise we'd have been really challenged.
One question I had, Ben, in terms of like this, this looks really impressive, as someone said in the chat. It's really comprehensive. It's a blend of kind of data-led and really logical piece of work. Is this standard practice across the country? Is this how everyone designs their networks? Or maybe a lot of places don't have a plan like this? Or would you not know because, you just work on the project you're assigned to? Yeah.
I'm a bit biased, I think, because no, I don't know. A lot of places don't do it. Like, I think this was the thing about the methodology. It was quite of its time. I think it was quite innovative, and I can't speak on behalf of other authorities, but other ones I've seen have all done it a bit differently. Like, say, for example, Bucks, the neighbouring county, I know their approach was much more, they divided the whole county into community groups. There was a particular name they had for it, like community boards or something, and within each board they were going to identify 2 preferred alignments. So theirs was much more almost like akin a bit to like the B network and the work that Brian Deegan did in Manchester. Was much more, what did people think was what was needed. I think our approach was a bit more blended in that we did the strategic objective element, the demand element, but then we did bring in the opportunities for the consultation and the views to kind of validate, and if at any point we missed anything, or and we're still working through that process now, then we would open to change.
Thank you. And then I'll just wrap up with 2 questions from the chat. So one from Rob, which is in terms of your deliverability assessment, did you engage with major scheme developers such as East West Rail as potential funders of future delivery? I'll leave that one. Yeah.
We haven't got that far in terms of, I think there's definitely sites within the county where officers are aware of particular sites where, there's effectively Oxford Greenways needs to be tied up very shortly because there is fundings, kind of 106 funding is there to be signed off, and they're trying to, ideally you'd get Greenways funding for it, but no, they didn't identify, it didn't go that far.
And in terms of well, I think we better leave it there because I think Ollie may have to leave fairly soon, so we need to bring him in. So thank you, Ben. That was really insightful, and probably has made lots of people jealous as well. So
thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, Ollie, we better get you on quick.
Hello, thanks so much. I'll just bring up my slideshow.
And while Ollie's doing that, reminder, this is Ollie Lord from the Clean Cities campaign, and over to you, Ollie.
Thanks so much. Yes, I would love to talk to you briefly about our concern that big cars are making our cities and towns much smaller. Very quickly, Clean Cities campaign, thanks for the intro, Claire. We're a European-wide campaign. We partner with roughly 120 different organizations, all the way from the grassroots level to the big NGOs across 20 countries. And I lead the campaign here in the UK. So whilst we're keen to see a shift from polluting vehicles, that does involve the electrification of transport. We're massive advocates for active and shared transport too. And just to mention that we have a campaign running called Streets for Kids, which is probably very relevant to this group. And there's a lot of activity taking place in May. And if you'd like to get involved with that, that's very much about supporting the introduction of school streets across the continent. But I'm here to talk to you briefly about our concern that cars are getting ever bigger and bigger. In fact, my colleagues, because we're hosted by the NGO T&E, they've done some research and analysis recently that have found that cars are getting 1 centimetre wider every 2 years. And that's based on new car sales. They've taken the models that are being sold and looked at the average increase in size by looking at the dimensions on their websites. Not only that, there's also plenty of evidence that demonstrates cars are also getting heavier and also much more powerful. So we've got this sort of big cauldron of issues that are associated with more powerful and larger cars, and a lot of that is being driven by the sales of SUVs. The UK is one of the worst for this, and we did an analysis recently that showed 62% of all new cars sold in the UK last year were SUVs. And of course, when I talk about SUVs, there's actually quite a broad segment of the size of these cars. So you can have smaller, more inverted commas, normal sized SUVs, and then you've got the really great monster ones. And there are some models that have increased in size by about 20 centimeters in just 6 years. So we've launched a brand new campaign called Carspreading. We've been trying to put, it's kind of our way of putting a finger on the phenomenon. And we felt like this was a really captivating way to describe it. I'd love to just explain to you that campaign and to give you a couple of ideas about how you might want to get involved as well. We're framing the cost of car spreading around the reduction in public space. So not only are half of all new cars sold in the UK not fitting in typical urban parking spaces, but also it's reducing the space for active travel. I mean, we've been waiting so long for the pavement parking consultation response from the government and some action in that area. But also if you think about, for example, a contraflow cycle lane in a town or a city, and actually maybe 10 years ago it was a bit more manageable, but now because you've got parked cars on either side that are much wider, it's turning into a situation where you just have to hold back and allow the traffic coming towards you to go, and then you can safely pass them as a result of all this space being taken away. They're also increasing road danger. Not only road danger if you're in a smaller car and you're hit by one of these monsters, but more importantly, if there's a 10 centimeter increase in the bonnet height, which a lot of these SUVs, the bonnets get really high, then actually you're 30% more likely to be seriously injured or killed if walking or cycling and you're hit by one on the road. There's a big climate and clean air challenge with this. They burn on average about 20% more fuel. And also even the electric vehicles, there's obviously an increased amount of critical and raw minerals that are used to create those vehicles. So ideally, they'd actually be a bit more normal size, so we can safeguard more of those minerals. And in addition to that, tire and brake wear is a challenge for local air quality because the emissions that come from heavier cars, you get more tire and brake wear. And then finally, we're also concerned that if we continue with this trend that more and more of the new cars being sold are SUVs that are also increasing in size, the transition to electric vehicles is going to be ever more challenging, particularly if we're trying to create a just transition to electric vehicles, because the more normal size, inverted commas, cars that are electric are being squeezed out of the market, and they are often the more affordable ones that we need to get on the market to either share it amongst our communities or ensure that lower income communities can also access them. We've been talking with UK car owners through public polling and YouGov, and I'm pleased to see that actually a majority agree that they're going to make parking more difficult. They're not necessary in towns and cities. This is SUVs, or they're bought more as status symbols than for practical use. And I can expect a fair number of people on this call would agree with that. And it's not just a UK phenomenon. Over in Paris, you might have heard about the action that's been brought in there by the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, who has actually tripled parking fees for SUVs being parked up from visitors into the city centre. And the preliminary data there is showing that there's actually been 2/3 fewer SUVs, and Parisians were backing that measure. So there are a few policies in play of how we might try and address this phenomenon. Manufacturing level, believe it or not, at the minute, the current regulations are you can build a car pretty much as wide as a truck. And there are no specific sort of vehicle dimension, and particularly on the width for cars. And we'd love to see some action there. From a purchasing perspective, how do we shift the consumer? Over in France, if you take the BMW X5, here it's a couple of grand. I think, your first year of vehicle excise duty. Over in France, it's tens of thousands of euros for that first purchase. So you can imagine that really does start to shift the dial in terms of the number of these cars that are registered, and the numbers do show that. And then finally, as Clean Cities campaign, we're always here to talk about what we think city and smaller town leaders could do in an urban area to try and handle this phenomenon. And we think parking policy is definitely has a big role here. There are already several local authorities who have tariffs based on the emissions of a car. We think the next step would be to introduce something around the dimensions of a car, because it's only fair that if you've got one of these big monster SUVs, that you'd pay a bit more than someone who has a smaller car. We've initiated this campaign. You can find us on our website, or if you Google it, you should get hold of it. Carspreading as a hashtag is running across our social channels, and we've been asking people to initially engage with the campaign. If you see this phenomenon where you're living, please just engage with us on social media, tag us, and especially use the hashtag Carspreading, and then we can kind of collate all these photos and get them as a carousel and really demonstrate this is a UK-wide phenomenon. We've also contributed some professional photos to the Climate Visuals Library so that media have access to royalty-free images so that they can actually create more of a conversation around this issue. And we're also part of a broader alliance called the SUV Alliance, which has a national manifesto on this issue, talking to some of those points I was making on vehicle dimensions and manufacturing, but also the advertising of these machines as well, and how influential that is, and drawing some parallels with the tobacco industry. There's also a tool on our website for you to use to help you contact your local councillor as well and see if they have a response to this challenge. I think this image is very striking, and it sums up the research that we're doing at the moment. We're hoping May, June, we're going to be publishing some new research that looks at the increase in the bonnet height of cars to actually demonstrate through analysis this is a phenomenon, and it's not just a trick of the eye. So we've already done the width analysis. We're going to be doing that with the bonnet heights very soon as well, and we'll be looking to initiate more conversation and potentially have a policy event as a launch for that analysis as well. So I'll end there because I'm a little pushed for time and I want to keep it short and snappy, but please do keep in touch with me. Join our newsletter as well, Clean Cities, if you'd just like to know a little bit more about what our organisation is doing. And I'm also available now for a little Q&A if there's anything in the chat. So I'll hand back to Claire.
Thank you so much, Ollie. I'm going to ask two quickly from the chat, and sorry, I didn't realise you had to go at 6. So the first one is your point about the kind of increase in bonnet heights. Have you any research, or is it worth looking at the issue of sight lines and how drivers' views are, impeded, affected, and because I guess the point about bonnet heights is you're saying the driver can't see, but have you got anything to kind of show that, sight lines?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can stay till about 5 past, so don't worry too much. We are looking at, that's all going to be wrapped up into this study effectively. So my colleague James is also working with an academic, or the university has just lost out my mind, but they're actually doing the scientific sort of analysis of what happens to sightlines as these bonnets get higher. And they've also been doing 3D models of vehicles as well, just to kind of show what it looks like as a view from the driver. And I'm hoping to see some sort of animation as a result of that study as well. So we really want to try and bring the issue to life through that research that I mentioned.
Shan asks, it's often said that cars are wider because of safety features, although I guess the question there is safety for who. Do you know if that's true, or is this just all about preference and selling things to people?
There is some truth in that. I mean, I'd say over the decades we've seen improvements in safety technology, but every modern new car needs to pass safety tests. So to some extent, this is also leaning into the car industry wanting to build bigger cars to make more profit effectively. And studies have shown they spend around 2,000 euros, I think, on advertising each models for each car that's sold. So there's a lot of money to be made in this, and they do often make a lot of the profit from all the trimmings that kind of come around it. So there's definitely some truth in cars have increased a bit in size because of safety features, but there's no way does it explain why cars need to be wider than 2 meters, for example, which is we're getting into that territory now.
Yeah. Danny has made the point in the chat that in Oxford they're lobbying for weight to be taken into account in Oxford's zero emission zone, and I know France have done some. They increased parking charges, I think, for SUVs. Are you doing any work on that sort of policy side, and what policies maybe should change to reflect the increased costs on public services of these larger vehicles?
That's definitely part of the conversation that will be had tomorrow at the House of Lords, launch of the SUV Alliance at a national level. So there's a manifesto on their website that talks about having a vehicle weight tax built into vehicle excise duty, for example. But also from a city or local authority perspective, we've majored on the parking policy because that's ultimately what most local authorities have access to as a tool. But the Oxford scheme, I wasn't aware of the conversation around integrating weight into that. I'd love to kind of catch up with the folks there. And you could argue, for example, the congestion charge in London could benefit from an SUV surcharge of some sort because at the end of the day, bigger cars cause more congestion. You're right, Claire, about France, though. They've not only got something at a national level through the tax on the vehicles, which is affecting car registrations, but also the Mayor of Paris brought in the parking charge increase to hundreds of euros to park your SUV in the city centre, and that's had a big change. That didn't affect the residents within their own, for want of a better word, borough of Paris, but if they move their car around Paris or if visitors come in, then it significantly affects them.
And in the last minute or two you've got left, Katie asks, is there guidance for how campaigners can take this forward locally? So I don't know if you want to go back to your sort of campaign and anything you'd ask that people on the call can do to help.
Yeah, totally. So I'll very quickly put the campaign website in the chat as well. So what we've done really, there are some people who can get involved a lot, some people just very lightly. I would start with just sharing images on social media. That'd be fantastic. But we have a fact sheet that you can download on our website. And you can take that to, whether you have campaign meetings with fellow campaigners and you can talk through some of the issues there. And also we've got a tool to write to your local councillor, and I'd love to engage with you. And if you do that and you hear back, I can support you on responses and maybe we can have a meeting about that. And if people have an idea that they would like to take this campaign to their community and they think there's maybe a little bit of an opportunity with their local council, then we could also potentially talk a little bit more about funding an activity, a campaign activity, for example. This is going to be a campaign that we'd like to run for at least for the next 6 to 9 months and see how we get on and potentially take it international as well. I've already got my colleagues in Spain and Italy jumping at the bit to kind of grab onto it, but we want to make sure that we kind of know what we're talking about here in the UK and then we can move on from that. So there's a whole window of opportunity to engage with us. I'd just love to hear, what ideas people have and also how much time they have to engage.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Ollie. I think we'll leave it there for now. I think you've explained the campaign brilliantly and how people can get involved. Some really good kind of insights there as well. So thank you everyone for joining. Next week on Active Travel Cafe, we have Kit Allwinter from Active Travel England, who's going to talk through the tools and resources they've got on their website for kind of checking on schemes and scheme design. So I think a lot of people will be interested in that. Some people may have been along to Mobility Camp, and Kit's one of the volunteers involved in Mobility Camp every year as well. So that should be a good session. That's next week. Then we've got a break for Easter for 2 weeks, possibly three weeks. And then we're back on the 29th of April with Ian Walker, who I think somebody mentioned earlier. Tim, was that you? You mentioned that, didn't you? Yeah, so Ian's actually, well, he's doing talk tonight at 7. You've got an hour. But if you can't make that tonight, he will be on Active Travel Cafe at the end of April. But we'll give that another plug nearer the time. Okay, thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and have a good rest of the week.